So, class, who can tell me the defining characteristics of a Class 9 Deathworld predator? Professor Zilthak's 6 eyes swept across the lecture hall, their stalks weaving hypnotically as they searched for a volunteer. The Xenthari loved their dramatic pauses almost as much as they loved categorizing every living thing in the galaxy into neat little boxes of terror. A pale blue tentacle shot up from the third row. Ooh, pick me! Yes, Student Velnari? The young Aquilan practically vibrated with excitement, her chromatophores flashing bright yellow with enthusiasm. Class 9 predators exhibit extreme aggression, pack-hunting behaviors, redundant vital systems, and... She paused dramatically, clearly having memorized this from the textbook. An unsettling tendency to pursue prey far beyond any reasonable caloric expenditure. Excellent. Zilthak's mandibles clicked in approval. And what world produces the most notorious examples of Class 9 predators? Terra! Came the chorus from half the class. Jake Mitchell, sitting in the back row and doing his absolute best impression of someone who gave a damn about xenobiology, nearly choked on his coffee. Terra. Right. Because apparently his homeworld had quite the reputation out here in the galactic community. He'd been attending the Centauri University of Xenological Studies for 3 months now, and every single week brought a new and fascinating revelation about just how much the rest of the galaxy viewed his species as walking nightmares. It was like being the only human at a convention for people terrified of humans. Except nobody knew he was human because, and here was the kicker, humans were supposedly extinct. Apparently about 50 years ago, some genius had decided to classify humanity as extinct due to planetary catastrophe, after a particularly nasty solar flare knocked out Earth's communications for about 6 months. By the time humans got their act together and started talking to the galaxy again, the paperwork had already gone through. And if there's one thing the Galactic Council loved more than bureaucracy, it was refusing to admit they'd made a mistake. Now then, Professor Zilthak continued, his voice taking on that special tone teachers used when they were about to deliver what they thought was a fascinating tidbit. Who can tell me about the most feared predator ever documented from Terra? Jake perked up despite himself. This ought to be good. A reptilian student, Saurian, if Jake remembered his species classifications correctly, raised a clawed hand. The Terran apex predator known as the human? Precisely, Student Cassix. The human, thankfully extinct now, was perhaps the most efficient killing machine the galaxy has ever produced. Zilthak's eye stalks turned toward a holographic display that flickered to life above his desk. Observe the terrifying physiological adaptations. Jake watched, fascinated and increasingly insulted, as an anatomical diagram of a human appeared in the air. It looked like something from a horror movie poster. Note the forward-facing eyes, Zilthak said, wielding his pointer stick like a weapon. Classic persistence hunter configuration. These creatures could track prey across vast distances, never tiring, never giving up. They possessed redundant vital systems. Observe how they could survive the loss of an entire lung, a kidney, significant blood loss, and even portions of their brain. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. Jake tried very hard not to look down at his perfectly normal human body with its apparently horrifying redundant organs. But most terrifying of all, the professor continued, his voice dropping to what probably passed for a whisper among Xenthari, was their pack-bonding behavior. Humans would form emotional attachments not just to their own species, but to virtually anything. They kept predators as companions, creatures they called dogs, that were essentially domesticated wolves. They formed bonds with prey animals. Some even formed attachments to their tools and weapons. Jake thought about his truck back home. He'd named it Bessie, and had definitely gotten a little misty-eyed when he'd had to sell it before coming to university. Maybe the professor had a point. I heard, whispered a student from the second row, a Forellian whose fur was currently standing on end, that they could survive in environments that would kill most species. Temperature ranges from near freezing to desert heat, atmospheric pressures that would crush us, radiation levels that would sterilize entire planets. Indeed, Zilthak's eyes gleamed with the fervor of someone who enjoyed scaring children. Humans were adapted to survive on what we now classify as a Class 12 Deathworld. The third planet of the Sol system was a hellscape of active tectonics, extreme weather, dangerous fauna, and atmospheric conditions that most species would consider barely habitable. Jake blinked. They were talking about Earth like it was Mordor. He thought about his grandmother's garden back in Ohio, with its tomatoes and hummingbird feeders, and that one aggressive squirrel that had declared war on the bird feeder. Hellscape indeed. Professor, called out a student Jake didn't recognize, something with way too many legs and an unfortunate tendency to shed scales when nervous. Is it true that humans could survive injuries that would be fatal to other species? Oh yes, student. Zilthak consulted his roster. Student Hickstal. Human endurance was legendary. They could survive blood loss that would kill 3 Zinthari, continue fighting with broken bones, and there are documented cases of humans surviving for days with punctured organs, severed limbs, and massive trauma. Jake thought about that time in high school when he'd broken his leg skateboarding and still hobbled to class because he had a chemistry test. Apparently, that made him some kind of monster. They also had an unsettling ability to consume substances that were toxic to most other species. Zilthak continued, really getting into his rhythm now. Ethanol, capsaicin, caffeine, all deadly poisons that humans ingested recreationally. Jake very slowly moved his coffee cup behind his tablet. And their pain tolerance, another student chimed in. I read that they would deliberately inflict pain on themselves for recreational purposes. Sports, Jake muttered under his breath, then realized that wasn't helping his case. But what made them truly terrifying? Professor Zilthak said, building to what was clearly his favorite part of the lecture, was their intelligence combined with their aggression. They were tool users of the highest order, capable of turning virtually anything into a weapon. A human with access to primitive tools could eliminate threats many times their size and strength. Jake thought about MacGyver and decided this was probably fair. They were also remarkable problem solvers, the professor continued. When faced with an obstacle, humans would rarely accept impossible as an answer. There are records of humans accomplishing feats that defied mathematical probability through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitations. A crystalline entity in the front row, their species communicated through harmonic resonances, chimed in with a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Jake's universal translator helpfully informed him this meant, Query: what caused the extinction of such a successful predator species? An excellent question, Student Harmony, Zilthak replied. The official records indicate a cascade failure of their planetary ecosystem following a solar event. However, some xenobiologists theorize that humans may have been victims of their own success. Their aggressive expansion and resource consumption may have outpaced their planet's ability to sustain them. Jake made a mental note to send a strongly worded letter to whoever was in charge of galactic record-keeping. Humans were doing just fine, thank you very much. Well, mostly fine. Climate change was still a thing, but they were working on it. Now, for your assignment this week, Professor Zilthak announced, and Jake's attention snapped back to the present. I want you to research and present on a specific Terran predator. Choose any species from the extensive catalog, but remember, I want to see analysis of hunting strategies, physiological adaptations, and ecological impact. Great. Jake was going to have to research Earth animals and pretend they were alien monsters. This semester just kept getting better. As the class filed out, chattering excitedly about their assignments, Jake hung back, ostensibly organizing his notes, but actually trying to process what he'd just heard. According to the rest of the galaxy, his species was extinct, his planet was uninhabitable, and he personally was the biological equivalent of the Terminator. He was mulling this over when he noticed he wasn't alone. Professor Zilthak was still at his desk, sorting through papers with the methodical precision of someone who had way too many students and not enough time. Professor? Jake approached carefully, trying to think of how to phrase his question without sounding suspicious. I was wondering, the records about Terra and its species, how accurate would you say they are? Zilthak's eye stalks swiveled toward him, and Jake got the uncomfortable feeling of being examined by a very intelligent predator, which, come to think of it, he probably was. Ah, student. Zilthak consulted his roster again. Student Webb. An interesting question. Why do you ask? Jake had registered under his mother's maiden name, figuring Jake Webb was less obviously human than Jake Mitchell. Not that it mattered, apparently, since everyone thought humans were extinct anyway. Well, it's just... some of the descriptions seem almost... mythological? Like, could any species really be that dangerous and still maintain a stable civilization? Professor Zilthak set down his papers and gave Jake his full attention, which was mildly terrifying when it involved 6 eyes on stalks. You raise an excellent point, Student Webb. There has been some debate in xenobiological circles about the accuracy of the Terran records. The data we have comes primarily from automated survey probes and long-range observation. No living being has ever actually encountered a human and survived to provide first-hand testimony. Jake nodded thoughtfully, trying to look like a student engaged in academic discourse rather than the subject of said discourse trying not to laugh. However, the professor continued. The physical evidence is quite compelling, Terran architecture, tool-making, and the sheer variety of species they apparently dominated on their homeworld suggests a level of adaptability and aggression that matches our theoretical models. What about their social structures? Jake asked, genuinely curious now. I mean, if they were such efficient predators, how did they cooperate enough to build a civilization? Another excellent question. Zilthak's mandibles clicked with what Jake was learning to recognize as approval. This is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of human behavior. They appear to have been capable of both extreme individual aggression and complex social cooperation. Pack bonding behavior taken to its logical extreme. Jake thought about his family, his friends back home, the way communities came together during disasters. Maybe pack bonding wasn't such a bad way to describe it. There are theories, the professor continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, that humans were essentially domesticated themselves, that they channeled their aggressive impulses into cooperative behaviors that allowed them to dominate their planet so completely. Domesticated by whom? By each other, Student Webb, by each other. Jake left the classroom with his head spinning and a growing appreciation for just how weird this whole situation was. He was a human, attending a university where they taught about humans as extinct monsters, and apparently doing a pretty good job of blending in with species that would probably run screaming if they knew what he was. The next few days were a blur of research for his assignment. Jake had decided to write about wolves, figuring it was close enough to dogs that he had some personal experience, but far enough from humans that he wouldn't accidentally reveal too much knowledge. He was deep in the university library, surrounded by holographic displays showing wolf pack behavior, when someone slid into the seat across from him. Fascinating choice of subject. Jake looked up to find himself staring at... well, he wasn't entirely sure what species he was looking at. Humanoid, but with skin that seemed to shift between blue and green depending on the angle, and eyes that were definitely not standard issue for any species he'd encountered so far. I'm sorry, Canis lupus, Terran pack predator. Not the most exotic choice, but certainly one of the more interesting from a behavioral standpoint. The stranger extended what might have been a hand, though it had one too many joints. I'm Alex, by the way, xenobiology major, same as you. Jake shook the offered appendage carefully. Jake, nice to meet you. So tell me, Jake, Alex said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone about to ask a very interesting question. What drew you to Terran predators specifically? There was something about the way Alex asked the question that made Jake's paranoia sensors start pinging. It was the kind of casual inquiry that wasn't casual at all. Well, Jake said carefully, Professor Zilthak made them sound fascinating. The whole apex predator thing, the pack behavior, seemed like a good topic for research. Alex nodded, but his eyes, which Jake was now noticing were an unusually pale blue, never left Jake's face. And what do you make of the extinction narrative? The what now? The official story. Solar flare, ecosystem collapse, total extinction. Doesn't it seem a bit convenient? Jake's internal alarm bells were now playing a full symphony. Convenient how? Alex leaned forward, lowering his voice. Think about it. A species that adaptable, that successful, completely wiped out by a solar event? Species that survived ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, asteroid impacts, all eliminated by some solar radiation. I hadn't really thought about it that way. The Galactic Council has a vested interest in keeping certain species classified as extinct. Alex continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Humans weren't just apex predators, Jake. They were innovators, explorers. They had this annoying habit of refusing to accept limitations imposed by other species. Jake was now officially in way over his head. Are you suggesting the extinction was fake? Alex smiled, and Jake noticed his teeth were just a little too sharp to be entirely comfortable. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that if humans were still around, they'd probably be smart enough to keep a low profile. Maybe even blend in with the general population at, say, a university where everyone assumes they're extinct. The two sat in silence for a moment, Jake trying to figure out if he was being threatened, recruited, or just messed with by a fellow student with too much time on his hands. Hypothetically speaking, Jake said finally, if someone were to be, conducting research on whether humans were actually extinct, what would they be looking for? Hypothetically. Alex's smile widened. They might look for someone with unusual knowledge of Terran species. Someone who chose to research pack predators. Someone whose physiological responses to stress don't quite match their supposed species classification. Jake glanced down at his hands, which he just now realized were probably shaking slightly. And what would this hypothetical researcher do with that information? Depends on the researcher, Alex said, standing up and gathering his materials. Some might report it to the authorities. Others might be more collaborative in their approach to xenobiological research. He paused at the edge of the table. Oh, and Jake? Your presentation on wolves is next week. You might want to be careful not to display too much first-hand knowledge of pack behavior. Just a friendly tip. With that, Alex walked away, leaving Jake alone with his research, and a growing certainty that his carefully constructed cover was beginning to develop some serious cracks. The next few days passed in a paranoid haze. Jake found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, analyzing every interaction for signs that his secret was out. Were his classmates asking more questions than usual? Was Professor Zilthak paying extra attention to his answers? Was that janitor actually a janitor or some kind of galactic intelligence operative? By the time presentation day arrived, Jake was a nervous wreck. He'd prepared his presentation on wolves with obsessive attention to detail, making sure every fact came from official galactic databases and not from, say, personal experience watching nature documentaries. Student Webb, Professor Zilthak called as Jake made his way to the front of the classroom. You may begin when ready. Jake activated the holographic display and launched into his presentation, carefully reciting facts about wolf pack structure, hunting strategies, and territorial behavior. He was doing fine, great even, until he got to the section on wolf-human interactions. Wolves were one of the few Terran predators that humans successfully domesticated, he began, reading directly from his notes. This process likely began when... Student Webb, interrupted a voice from the back of the room. Jake looked up to see Alex raising his hand, that same knowing smile on his face. Could you elaborate on the domestication process? How exactly did humans manage to domesticate such an efficient predator? Jake's mouth went dry. This was exactly the kind of question he'd been hoping to avoid. Well, according to the research, it was a gradual process. Wolves that were less aggressive toward humans had access to food sources. But how did they identify which wolves were suitable for domestication? Alex pressed. Surely this would require significant knowledge of wolf behavior patterns. The records indicate that humans were exceptionally skilled at reading animal behavior, Jake managed, acutely aware that every eye in the classroom was now focused on him. Fascinating, Alex continued. And these dogs that resulted from domestication, they maintained pack-bonding behaviors with humans? Yes, they... Wait. Jake stopped, realizing he was about to walk into a trap. I mean, according to the theoretical models, the pack bonding would have transferred to human family units. Theoretical models, Alex repeated. Of course. You wouldn't have any first-hand observational data to support that theory, would you? The classroom was dead silent. Jake could feel sweat beading on his forehead, which probably wasn't helping his case since most species in the room didn't sweat. No, of course not. Humans are extinct. Right, Alex said, settling back in his chair. Extinct, my mistake. Jake somehow managed to finish his presentation without further incident, though he spent the entire time acutely aware of Alex's knowing gaze. When he finally returned to his seat, his hands were shaking and his shirt was soaked with sweat. After class, as students filed out discussing their various presentations, Jake hung back again. He needed answers, and he had a feeling Alex was the only one who could provide them. Quite the presentation, Student Webb, came Professor Zilthak's voice from behind him. Very thorough. Jake turned to find the professor sorting through papers again, but this time all 6 of his eyes were focused directly on Jake. Thank you, Professor. Tell me, Zilthak continued conversationally, have you given any thought to what you'd like to specialize in for your advanced studies? Not really, sir. Perhaps you might consider xenopsychology, the study of how different species think, behave, adapt to new environments. The professor's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. It's a field that requires a very particular kind of insight, the ability to see things from multiple perspectives. Jake nodded slowly, not sure where this was going. Of course, Zilthak continued. It also requires a certain degree of discretion. Some research is too sensitive for general publication. Sensitive how? The professor set down his papers and gave Jake his full attention. Student Webb, in my 40 years of teaching xenobiology, I've learned to recognize when a student possesses unusual insight into their subject matter. Natural talent, one might say. Jake's heart was hammering so hard he was surprised it wasn't visible through his shirt. Now I'm not asking any uncomfortable questions, Zilthak continued. But if a student were to find themselves in need of guidance, academic or otherwise, my office hours are quite flexible. With that, the professor gathered his materials and headed for the door, pausing just before he left. Oh, and Student Webb, you might want to speak with Student Alex about forming a study group. I have a feeling you two might have more in common than you realize. Jake was still processing this conversation when Alex appeared beside him as if summoned. Subtle as a brick to the face, isn't he? Alex commented, watching the professor disappear down the hallway. Is everyone at this university completely insane, or is it just me? Alex laughed, a surprisingly human sound. Little of both, probably. Come on, let's grab some coffee and have a chat. I think it's time we stopped dancing around the obvious. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a quiet corner of the university cafe, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation in at least 6 different languages. Alex had ordered something that looked like liquid metal, while Jake stuck with coffee, which earned him several curious glances from nearby tables. So, Alex said, taking a sip of his decidedly non-Newtonian beverage, how long have you been pretending to be extinct? Jake nearly choked on his coffee. I have no idea what you're talking about. Jake, buddy, we both know you're human. The question is whether you're going to keep pretending otherwise, or if we can have an actual conversation. Jake stared at Alex for a long moment, trying to figure out what his options were. Deny everything and hope for the best? Make a run for it? Fake a medical emergency? How did you know? He asked finally. Oh, where do I start? Alex grinned. The forward-facing eyes, the way you sweat when stressed, the fact that you drink coffee like it's not a deadly poison, your obvious familiarity with Terran species. He paused. Plus, the fact that I'm not actually what I appear to be either. Jake blinked. What? Alex's form shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from pavement, and suddenly Jake was looking at a completely different person. Still humanoid, but with darker skin, different facial features, and eyes that were now a warm brown instead of pale blue. Shapeshifter? Jake guessed. Close. Holographic projection with some basic biomimicry thrown in. Alex, or whoever he actually was, gestured to what looked like a small device attached to his collar. Changeling tech, acquired through completely legitimate channels, I assure you. And you are? Marcus Rivera, formerly of Luna Colony, currently of nowhere in particular. He extended his hand again, and this time Jake shook it without hesitation. Nice to meet you, fellow extinct person. Jake leaned back in his chair, trying to process this latest revelation. There are more of us? More humans? Oh, absolutely. Turns out being officially extinct is a pretty useful cover for certain kinds of activities. What kinds of activities? Marcus glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward conspiratorially. Jake, what do you know about why humans were really classified as extinct? Solar flare knocked out communications, bureaucratic mix-up, council refused to fix their mistake? That's the cover story, yeah. Want to know what really happened? Jake nodded, though he was beginning to suspect he might not like the answer. 50 years ago, humanity made first contact with the Galactic Council. Big moment, right? Except it didn't go quite the way anyone expected. Marcus's expression grew serious. See, the Council has this system. They classify species based on threat level, assign them roles in the galactic community, determine what kind of technology they're allowed to have, what planets they can colonize, that sort of thing. And humans didn't fit their classification system? Oh, we fit all right. Class 9. Deathworld predators, potential threat level maximum, recommended for immediate containment and monitoring. Marcus's smile was bitter. The Council took one look at human history and decided we were too dangerous to be allowed free run of the galaxy. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. So they declared us extinct. Easier than trying to wipe us out, and more politically palatable than admitting they were too scared to let us join the galactic community. Marcus took another sip of his metallic beverage. Of course, they underestimated human stubbornness. When the Council cut off communication with Earth, humanity didn't just roll over and accept isolation. What did we do? What humans always do when told something is impossible. We figured out a way to do it anyway. Marcus's grin was back, and this time it had a distinctly predatory edge. Took about 20 years, but we developed our own FTL technology, our own interstellar communication networks, our own colonies. All completely off the books, as far as the Council is concerned. Jake stared at his coffee, trying to wrap his head around the implications. So there's an entire secret human civilization out there? Multiple civilizations, actually. Turns out when you scatter humans across the galaxy and tell them to stay hidden, they get creative about it. Marcus counted on his fingers. We've got agricultural colonies, mining operations, research stations, trading posts, even a few military installations that the Council would absolutely lose their collective minds if they knew about. And everyone's just okay with being officially extinct? Jake, Do you have any idea how much easier it is to do business when people think you don't exist? We can go anywhere, trade with anyone, explore any system we want, and as long as we don't advertise our species, nobody asks uncomfortable questions. Jake thought about his own experience at the university. Is that why you're here? Research? Among other things. Universities are great places to gather intelligence on how the council operates, what they know about various species where they might be vulnerable. Marcus's expression grew more serious. Plus, places like this are good for recruiting. Recruiting for what? Ever hear of the Terran Liberation Front? Jake nearly choked on his coffee again. That sounds ominous? It's exactly as ominous as it sounds. See, not everyone in the secret human civilization is content to stay hidden forever. Some folks think it's time the galaxy learned that humanity isn't as extinct as advertised. And you're one of those folks? I'm one of the folks gathering information to help those folks make informed decisions about the best way to not be extinct anymore. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Which brings me to why I'm talking to you. Jake had a sinking feeling he knew where this was going. You want to recruit me? I want to offer you a choice. You can keep pretending to be whatever species you've been pretending to be, finish your degree, and go back to whatever quiet life you've built for yourself. No judgment, by the way. Staying hidden is a perfectly valid survival strategy. Or you can come with me and see what humanity has been up to for the past 50 years. Meet some of your fellow extinct people. Maybe help decide what our species does next. Jake stared out the cafe window, watching alien students hurry across the campus plaza. 3 months ago, his biggest concern had been whether his fake transcripts would hold up to scrutiny. Now he was being recruited for some kind of interstellar human resistance movement. If I say no, then you say no. I wipe your memory of this conversation, you go back to your classes, and we never met. Marcus's expression was completely serious now. Jake, I'm not going to pressure you into this, but I will say that opportunities like this don't come along very often. What kind of opportunity? The opportunity to help determine the future of the human race. The council classified us as too dangerous to exist in civilized society. Maybe it's time we showed them just how right they were. Jake thought about Professor Zilthak's lectures, about the way his classmates shuddered when discussing human predators, about the casual assumption that his entire species was extinct. He thought about his family back on Earth, living their lives completely unaware that the rest of the galaxy considered them mythological monsters. If I come with you, he said finally, what exactly would I be signing up for? Marcus's grin was back, and this time it was absolutely feral. Jake, my friend, you'd be signing up to remind the galaxy why they were afraid of humans in the first place. Jake finished his coffee, set the cup down with a decisive clink, and looked Marcus straight in the eye. When do we leave? 3 hours later, Jake found himself aboard what Marcus cheerfully described as a ship that definitely doesn't exist, heading toward a destination that was absolutely not on any official star charts. The vessel itself was sleek, efficient, and bore absolutely no resemblance to any Earth technology Jake had ever seen. Reverse-engineered council tech, Marcus explained as they lifted off from the university's private shuttle port. Turns out when you officially don't exist, nobody notices when you steal their blueprints. The journey to wherever they were going would take about 6 hours, Marcus had said, which gave Jake plenty of time to question his life choices and wonder if he'd just made the biggest mistake in human history. So, he said as Marcus piloted them through a series of hyperspace jumps, what's the plan here? Are we going to dramatically reveal that humanity still exists? Start a war? Take over the galaxy? Nothing that dramatic, Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he wouldn't necessarily be opposed to those options. The TLF leadership just wants to gather intelligence and assess options. Most of the human colonies are doing fine staying hidden, but there are some advantages to not being officially extinct, such as legal trade agreements for one. Right now everything we do has to be under the table. We can't sign treaties, can't establish formal diplomatic relations, can't even file complaints when someone tries to colonize systems we're already using. Marcus gestured toward the navigation display, which showed their current positions somewhere between star systems Jake didn't recognize. Plus, there's the whole issue of new colonies. Earth's getting a bit crowded, and it's hard to establish new settlements when you're not supposed to exist. Jake nodded thoughtfully. What about the Council's original concerns? I mean, if they classified humans as too dangerous. You mean, are we actually as scary as they think we are? Marcus's laugh was not entirely reassuring. Jake, buddy, they don't know the half of it. The rest of the journey passed in a blur of hyperspace jumps and increasingly surreal conversation about secret human colonies, underground trade networks, and something Marcus kept referring to as the Darwin incident, but refused to explain in detail. Finally, they dropped out of hyperspace near what looked like a perfectly ordinary asteroid field. "Welcome," Marcus announced with obvious pride, "to Haven Station." Jake looked out the viewport at the asteroids, trying to figure out what he was supposed to be seeing. "It's very rocky. Look closer." Jake squinted and gradually began to make out structures hidden among the asteroids. What he'd initially taken for natural rock formations were actually carefully camouflaged installations, connected by barely visible transport tubes and communication arrays. "Holy shit," he breathed. 20,000 people, fully self-sufficient, completely invisible to long-range scans, Marcus said as he guided their ship toward what Jake now realized was a docking bay carved into the largest asteroid. "Welcome to the capital of humanity's shadow government." The docking bay was bustling with activity. Humans in various types of work clothing moving cargo, maintaining ships, and generally looking like they belonged to a thriving civilization that definitely wasn't supposed to exist. "Jake," Marcus said as they disembarked, "I'd like you to meet Director Elizabeth Kane, head of Terran Intelligence." Jake turned to find himself facing a woman who looked to be in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. "Mr. Webb," she said, extending her hand. "Marcus tells me you've been getting a first-hand education in how the galaxy views our species." "It's been illuminating," Jake admitted. "I imagine it has. Walk with me, if you would." Director Kane led them through a series of corridors that were clearly carved from solid rock, but fitted with advanced life support systems and communication equipment. The overall effect was like being inside a high-tech cave. "Tell me, Mr. Webb, what did you think of your xenobiology classes?" "Honestly, it was like attending a seminar on why everyone's afraid of humans, taught by people who don't know any humans." Kane's smile was sharp. "An accurate assessment. The Council's propaganda machine has been very effective at maintaining the narrative that humanity is extinct and was too dangerous to survive anyway." They entered a large chamber that Jake realized was some kind of command center. Holographic displays showed star charts, communication intercepts, and what looked like surveillance footage from various Council installations. "The question," Kane continued, "is what we do about it. Marcus mentioned the Terran Liberation Front wants to reveal that humanity isn't extinct. That's one option. The dramatic approach suddenly announced to the galaxy that reports of our extinction were greatly exaggerated." Kane gestured toward one of the displays, which showed what looked like a Council military installation. It would certainly get their attention. But it would also likely result in the Council attempting to finish what they started 50 years ago. They were afraid of humans then. Imagine how they'd react to learning we've spent 50 years building a secret interstellar civilization. Jake studied the displays around them, trying to process the implications. "So what's the alternative?" "The subtle approach. Instead of announcing our existence, we simply become unextinct. Gradually, individual humans start appearing in various Council systems, with perfectly legitimate documentation showing they're refugees from isolated colony ships. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening. And then what?" Kane's smile was absolutely predatory. "Then we remind the galaxy why humans were considered apex predators in the first place. Not through violence or aggression, but through what we do best: adapting, surviving, and thriving in environments that weren't designed for us." She gestured toward another display, this one showing what looked like trade routes and economic data. "Did you know that human traders, operating under false species identifications, now control approximately 15% of the galaxy's rare metal trade? Or that human-developed agricultural techniques have increased crop yields on 47 different worlds? Or that human engineers have solved infrastructure problems that Council experts considered impossible?" Jake stared at the displays, pieces clicking into place. "We're already integrating into galactic society. We're just doing it quietly." "Exactly. The Council thinks they eliminated a threat, but what they actually did was force humanity to evolve beyond their ability to control us." Kane's eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride, or might have been anticipation of revenge. "We're not the same species that made first contact 50 years ago, Mr. Webb. We're something new, something better adapted to galactic civilization. Something better adapted to surviving in a galaxy that doesn't want us to exist." Kane turned to face him directly. "Which brings me to why you're here." Jake had been wondering when they'd get to that part. "Your experience at the university has given you unique insight into how the Council views humanity. You've seen their educational programs, their propaganda, their assumptions about what we are and what we're capable of. Kane gestured toward Marcus. Combined with Marcus's intelligence gathering and your academic credentials, you're in a position to help us with something very important. Which is? We want you to go back to the university, complete your degree. But this time, instead of just observing how they teach about humans, we want you to start subtly correcting their assumptions. Jake blinked. You want me to be a double agent in Xenobiology 101? We want you to be exactly what you've been, a human blending into galactic society. But now you'll be doing it with purpose. Kane activated a holographic display that showed what looked like academic records. We've arranged for you to transfer into the advanced xenopsychology program. Professor Zilthak, despite his dramatic teaching style, is actually one of the galaxy's leading experts on predator species behavior. And you want me to, what? Convince him humans weren't so bad? We want you to help him understand that the Council's classification system might be fundamentally flawed. Marcus stepped forward, his expression serious. Think about it, Jake. Every species in the galaxy accepts the Council's assessment that humans were too dangerous to coexist with civilized society. But what if that assessment was based on incomplete information? Kane nodded. Professor Zilthak is influential. His research shapes Council policy on threat assessment for newly contacted species. If we can demonstrate that their understanding of human behavior is inaccurate, then maybe they'd reconsider the extinction classification. Jake was beginning to see the bigger picture. This isn't about revealing that humans are still alive. This is about changing how the galaxy thinks about what humans are. Precisely. The Council fears us because they believe we're unstoppable predators with no capacity for peaceful coexistence. But you've seen how humans actually integrate into galactic society when given the chance. Jake thought about his time at the university, making friends with classmates from dozens of different species, working together on projects, participating in the same social activities as everyone else. He hadn't acted like a terrifying predator. He'd acted like a college student. You want me to be living proof that their assumptions are wrong. We want you to be yourself, Mr. Webb. Just more strategically. Kane's smile was almost maternal. If mothers were former intelligence operatives planning interstellar political campaigns. The galaxy believes humans are extinct monsters. You have the opportunity to show them we're something much more dangerous, which is neighbors. 2 weeks later, Jake was back at Centauri University, officially enrolled in the advanced xenopsychology program and trying very hard to act like he hadn't just been briefed by a secret human intelligence organization. Professor Zilthak had been delighted by his transfer request, apparently interpreting Jake's interest in predator species behavioral modification as academic enthusiasm rather than species rehabilitation. Ah, Student Webb! The professor greeted him as he entered the much smaller graduate seminar room. I trust you're prepared for today's discussion on pack bonding behaviors in extinct species? Absolutely, Professor, Jake replied, settling into his seat and trying not to think about how surreal his life had become. The graduate program was significantly different from the undergraduate lectures. Instead of dramatic presentations about terrifying predators, the discussions were more nuanced, more analytical, and significantly more uncomfortable for someone who was secretly the subject of study. Today we'll be examining the theoretical models for human social structures, Professor Zilthak announced to the dozen students in the seminar. Based on archaeological evidence and extrapolation from related species, xenopsychologists have developed several hypotheses about how humans might have organized their societies. Jake opened his tablet and prepared to take notes on his own species' theoretical social organization. The dominant theory, the professor continued, suggests that humans would have organized into strict hierarchical pack structures, with alpha individuals dominating through displays of aggression and physical superiority. Jake's hand shot up before he could stop himself. Professor, is that necessarily the most likely model? 6 eye stalks swiveled toward him. An interesting question, Student Webb. What alternative would you propose? Jake realized he was about to walk a very fine line between academic discussion and accidentally revealing classified information about human civilization. Well, he said carefully, most successful pack-bonding species actually develop more complex social structures than simple dominance hierarchies. Cooperation and resource sharing often prove more effective than pure aggression. But humans were apex predators, interjected another student, a crystalline entity whose harmonics indicated skepticism. Surely their social structures would reflect predatory behavioral patterns. Not necessarily, Jake replied, warming to his theme. Consider that humans were also tool users and problem solvers. Pack hunting requires coordination, communication, and the ability to work together toward common goals. Pure aggression would actually be counterproductive for that kind of behavior. Professor Zilthak's mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign, Jake had learned, of intense intellectual interest. Continue your reasoning, Student Webb. If humans were as adaptable as the records suggest, their social structures would have needed to be flexible enough to handle different environments and challenges. Rigid hierarchies don't adapt well. Jake was gaining confidence now, despite the fact that he was essentially giving a presentation on human sociology to a room full of aliens. A more likely model would be cooperative groups with fluid leadership roles based on expertise and situation. Fascinating, the professor murmured. And what evidence would support such a model? Jake thought quickly. The diversity of human archaeological sites suggests they successfully colonized a wide range of environments on their homeworld. That kind of adaptability would require sophisticated social cooperation, not just predatory aggression. But how would they resolve conflicts within these cooperative groups? Asked another student. Without clear dominance hierarchies, wouldn't human groups have been unstable? This was dangerous territory, but Jake pressed on. Maybe they developed alternative conflict resolution methods, communication, negotiation, even formal systems for mediating disputes. The room fell silent. Jake was beginning to worry he'd gone too far when Professor Zilthak spoke up. Student Webb, your proposed model would suggest that humans were not simply predators, but rather a species capable of complex social organization and peaceful coexistence. It's possible, Jake said carefully. If such a model were accurate, the professor continued thoughtfully, it would have significant implications for the Council's threat assessment protocols. Jake's heart rate spiked. How so? The current classification system assumes that predatory species with high intelligence are inherently aggressive toward other species. But if humans were capable of cooperative behavior within their own species, Zilthak's eye stalks waved contemplatively. They might have been capable of peaceful coexistence with other species as well. Which would mean, said the crystalline student, their harmonics now indicating excitement rather than skepticism, that the extinction might have been unfortunate. Unfortunate indeed, Professor Zilthak agreed. If humans had survived to make contact with galactic civilization, they might have been valuable members of the galactic community, rather than a threat to be contained. Jake tried very hard to keep his expression neutral, while internally celebrating what felt like a major victory for human public relations. Of course, the professor continued, this is all purely theoretical. Without living subjects to study, we can only speculate about human behavioral patterns. Right, Jake agreed. Purely theoretical. The seminar continued for another hour, with increasingly sophisticated discussions of human social psychology, all based on Jake's carefully guided input. By the end of class, Professor Zilthak was practically vibrating with intellectual excitement. Student Webb, he said as the other students filed out, I wonder if you might be interested in collaborating on a research project. Jake's carefully maintained calm cracked slightly. What kind of research project? I'm preparing a paper for the Journal of Xenopsychological Studies on the need to revise threat assessment protocols for extinct species. Your insights today suggest you have a remarkable intuitive grasp of predator species psychology. That sounds fascinating, Professor. Excellent. The paper argues that the Council's current classification system may be based on incomplete or biased data, particularly regarding species like humans that were classified as extinct before proper behavioral studies could be conducted. Jake nodded, trying to process the implications. Professor Zilthak wanted him to help write a paper arguing that the Council's assessment of humanity was wrong. It was exactly what Kane and Marcus had hoped for, but it also felt like he was walking a tightrope over a very deep canyon. The deadline for submission is next month, the professor continued. I believe your perspective could be invaluable in developing a more nuanced understanding of how extinct predator species might have integrated into galactic civilization. I'd be honored to help, Professor. As Jake left the classroom, his mind was racing. In the span of a single seminar, he'd managed to plant seeds of doubt about humanity's threat level in the mind of one of the galaxy's leading xenopsychologists. Kane and Marcus would be pleased. But he was also acutely aware that he was now committed to helping write an academic paper about his own species' theoretical psychological profile. The margin for error on this project was essentially zero. One slip, one too specific detail, one piece of information that couldn't be explained by archaeological evidence, and his cover would be blown. On the other hand, if they could pull it off, They might actually succeed in rehabilitating humanity's reputation in galactic academic circles, which was either a brilliant long-term strategy for species reintegration or the most elaborate academic prank in history. Jake was still mulling over the implications when his communication device chimed with an encrypted message from Marcus. "How's the teaching career going?" He typed back, "I think I just agreed to co-author a paper on why humans weren't as scary as everyone thinks." Marcus's response was immediate. "That's either the best news I've heard all week, or we're about to accidentally start an interstellar incident. Possibly both." Jake stared at the message for a moment, then typed, "When you put it like that, it sounds exactly like something humans would do." "That," Marcus replied, "is exactly the point." The next month was a blur of research, writing, and increasingly surreal conversations with Professor Zilthak about human psychology. Jake found himself in the bizarre position of having to pretend to speculate about behavioral patterns he knew from personal experience, while making sure his speculation aligned with officially non-existent archaeological evidence. The paper, tentatively titled Reassessing Threat Classifications, a case study in predator species social integration, was shaping up to be either a groundbreaking work of xenopsychological theory or the most dangerous document Jake had ever helped create. "Your section on cooperative hunting behaviors is particularly insightful," Professor Zilthak commented during one of their research sessions. "The way you've connected pack hunting strategies to potential diplomatic behaviors is quite ingenious." Jake tried to look pleased rather than terrified. "Thank you, Professor. I just tried to think about how those behavioral patterns might translate to interspecies interactions." "Indeed. And your analysis of human adaptability suggests they would have been remarkably flexible in their approach to galactic integration." The professor's eye stalks waved thoughtfully. "I confess, Student Webb, your perspective on this topic has fundamentally changed my understanding of what human civilization might have looked like." "Changed it how?" "When I first began studying Terran species, I viewed humans as apex predators, efficient, dangerous, but ultimately limited by their aggressive nature." Zilthak gestured toward their draft paper. "But your research suggests they were something much more complex. Adaptable predators capable of sophisticated social cooperation." Jake nodded, trying to look like this was a purely academic realization rather than a description of his Tuesday morning. "If such a species had survived to make contact with the Council," the professor continued, "they might have been among our most valuable allies. Or," Jake said carefully, "they might have been exactly what the Council was afraid of." "How so?" "Well, think about it from the Council's perspective. A species that's adaptable, intelligent, cooperative, and capable of thriving in environments that would kill most other species. That's not just a potential ally. That's a potential competitor." Professor Zilthak's mandibles clicked rapidly. "You're suggesting the threat assessment was less about aggression and more about capability?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the Council wasn't afraid of humans because they were violent. Maybe they were afraid because humans were competent." The professor leaned back in his chair, considering this. "A species classification based on fear of competition rather than fear of aggression. That would explain some inconsistencies in the historical records." Jake felt like he was walking on increasingly thin ice, but he pressed on. "It would also suggest that the extinction might have been convenient for certain interests within the Council." "Student Webb," Professor Zilthak said quietly, "are you suggesting that human extinction was not entirely accidental?" Jake's mouth went dry. He'd meant to suggest that the Council might have been relieved by humanity's apparent extinction, not that they'd actively caused it. But now that the words were out there, "I'm suggesting that the official records deserve closer scrutiny," he said finally. The two sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging in the air between them. "Student Webb," the professor said eventually, "if such a theory were accurate, it would have profound implications for Council policy toward other newly contacted species." "It would," Jake agreed. "It would also be extremely dangerous to publish without substantial evidence." Jake nodded, acutely aware that they were discussing potential galactic political conspiracies in a university library. "Perhaps," Professor Zilthak continued, "we should focus our paper on the psychological assessment aspects and leave the political implications for future research." "Probably wise, Professor." But even as they agreed to tone down the more inflammatory aspects of their research, Jake could see that seeds of doubt had been planted. Professor Zilthak was beginning to question not just the Council's assessment of humanity, but the circumstances of humanity's supposed extinction. which was either exactly what Kane and Marcus had hoped for, or exactly the kind of attention they'd been trying to avoid. Jake's communication device buzzed with another encrypted message. Status update requested. He glanced around the library, then typed back. Paper nearly complete. May have accidentally suggested council conspiracy to eliminate humans. The response took longer this time. Define accidentally. Jake sighed and typed. Professor asked good questions. I gave honest answers. Might need extraction if this goes sideways. Negative on extraction. You're exactly where we need you to be. Continue mission. Jake stared at the message, then typed. What mission exactly? The one where you remind the galaxy why they should have been more afraid of human intelligence than human aggression. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the university's main auditorium, watching Professor Zilthak present their joint research to an audience of xenobiologists, council representatives, and what looked like half the galactic academic community. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications, the professor began, his 6 eyes scanning the packed auditorium. Today we present research that challenges fundamental assumptions about threat assessment and species classification. Jake sat in the front row, trying to look like a proud graduate student, rather than someone who might be about to accidentally trigger an interstellar diplomatic incident. Our case study focuses on the extinct Terran species commonly known as humans. Professor Zilthak continued. Through careful analysis of archaeological evidence and comparative behavioral studies, we have developed a new model for understanding how this species might have integrated into galactic civilization. The presentation proceeded smoothly through their research on human social structures, cooperative behaviors, and adaptability. Jake found himself oddly proud of their work, despite the fact that he was essentially listening to an academic analysis of his own species. But then, Professor Zilthak reached the section on implications for council policy. Our research suggests that the current threat classification system may be fundamentally flawed, he announced, and Jake felt the atmosphere in the auditorium shift. Species are currently classified based primarily on aggressive behaviors and physical capabilities. However, our analysis indicates that the most significant factor in determining a species' potential threat level may actually be their adaptability and intelligence. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Several council representatives were leaning forward in their seats. Furthermore, the professor continued, our research raises questions about the circumstances surrounding human extinction. The official records indicate ecosystem collapse following a solar event, but the archaeological evidence suggests a species too adaptable to be eliminated by such an occurrence. Jake's palms were sweating. This was the part where Professor Zilthak was supposed to stick to the psychological assessment and avoid political implications. This leads us to a troubling conclusion, the professor said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent auditorium. Either our understanding of human adaptability is incorrect, or the extinction event was not entirely natural. The auditorium erupted. Council representatives were on their feet. Xenobiologists were shouting questions, and Jake was fairly certain he could see security personnel moving toward the exits. Professor Zilthak raised his hands for silence. I am not suggesting conspiracy or malfeasance, he said, though his tone suggested he absolutely was. I am simply noting that the available evidence does not support the official narrative. A council representative, a tall, pale being with too many joints in their arms, stood up. Professor Zilthak, are you questioning the accuracy of official council records? I am questioning the completeness of those records, yes. And what would you propose as an alternative explanation for human extinction? The professor's eye stalks swiveled toward Jake for just a moment, so briefly that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. I would propose, Professor Zilthak said carefully, that humanity may not be as extinct as our records indicate. The auditorium fell dead silent. Jake felt like his heart had stopped. This was not part of the plan. This was Professor Zilthak going completely off script and essentially announcing to the galaxy that humans might still be alive. The council representative's expression was unreadable, but their voice was deadly calm. Professor, are you suggesting that humans have survived and are currently living undetected within council space? I am suggesting, the professor replied, that any species as adaptable as our research indicates humans would be unlikely to be completely eliminated by a single catastrophic event. And if they had survived, they would likely be intelligent enough to remain hidden until they were ready to reveal themselves. Jake's communication device buzzed with an encrypted message, but he didn't dare check it. He was fairly certain it would be some variation of, "What the hell is happening?" Furthermore, Professor Zilthak continued, apparently deciding that if he was going to derail his academic career, he might as well do it thoroughly. If humans are still alive and have been successfully integrating into galactic society without our knowledge, it would prove that our original threat assessment was incorrect. How so? The council representative asked, though their tone suggested they really didn't want to know the answer. Because a truly dangerous species would not need to hide. They would simply take what they wanted by force. The professor's mandibles clicked with what Jake was beginning to recognize as satisfaction. The fact that humans, if they exist, have chosen to integrate quietly suggests a preference for cooperation over conquest. Professor Zilthak, another council representative, stood up. These are serious allegations. Do you have any evidence to support your theories? The professor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the auditorium. When his gaze fell on Jake, there was something in his expression that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. I have one piece of evidence, he said finally. Student Webb, would you please stand? Jake's blood turned to ice. Every eye in the auditorium was suddenly focused on him, and he was acutely aware that he was probably about to become the center of the biggest diplomatic incident in galactic history. He stood slowly, his mind racing through possible escape routes and contingency plans. Student Webb has been my research partner on this project, Professor Zilthak announced to the crowd. His insights into human psychology have been remarkably accurate. Jake forced himself to remain calm, though he was fairly certain everyone in the auditorium could hear his heart hammering. In fact, the professor continued, Student Webb's understanding of human behavior is so precise that one might almost think he had first-hand experience with the species. The auditorium was so quiet Jake could hear his own breathing. Which, Professor Zilthak said, his 6 eyes fixed directly on Jake, would be quite remarkable for someone studying an extinct species. Jake stared back at the professor, realizing that his cover had been blown not by careful investigation or advanced surveillance, but by an alien academic who'd simply paid attention to his students' homework. Professor, he said quietly, I think we need to talk. I think, Student Webb, that we need to do considerably more than talk. Professor Zilthak's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. I think we need to discuss the future of human-galactic relations. Jake looked out at the auditorium full of aliens, council representatives, and xenobiologists, all staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to terror to what might have been anticipation. He thought about Kane and Marcus, about the secret human colonies, about 50 years of hiding and careful integration. He thought about his classmates who'd spent months discussing humans as extinct monsters while sitting next to one in every class. And then he thought about Professor Zilthak's words. A truly dangerous species wouldn't need to hide. Jake took a deep breath, looked directly at the council representative who'd been asking the uncomfortable questions, and smiled. My name is Jake Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. I'm from Earth, 3rd planet of the Sol system. And Professor Zilthak is absolutely right. Reports of humanity's extinction have been greatly exaggerated. The auditorium erupted into chaos, but Jake barely noticed. He was too busy enjoying the look of absolute terror on the council representative's face, as they realized that everything they'd feared about humans had just walked up to them and introduced itself politely. After 50 years of hiding, humanity was officially back on the galactic stage, and they were about to remind everyone why apex predators were called apex for a reason. Epilogue. 6 months later. Jake stood on the observation deck of Haven Station, watching as the latest batch of refugee ships arrived from Earth. In the month since what the galactic media had dubbed the Mitchell Revelation, humans had been emerging from hiding throughout Council space, all with perfectly legitimate documentation and completely plausible cover stories. Funny how quickly the bureaucracy moved when it turned out the species you'd declared extinct had been quietly integrating into your civilization for decades. Admiring your handiwork? Marcus joined him at the viewport, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Real Earth coffee, not the synthetic stuff Jake had been drinking at university. Just thinking about Professor Zilthak's latest paper, Jake replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Did you see the title? Cooperative Integration Strategies. How Humans Became the Galaxy's Most Successful Invasive Species. Marcus laughed. I love that man. He's got a real gift for academic trolling. The council's still trying to figure out how many humans are actually out there, Jake continued. Last count was somewhere around 50 million, but I think Kane's people are lowballing it. Smart strategy. Let them get used to the idea gradually. Marcus gestured toward the arriving ships. Speaking of which, Earth's officially requesting membership in the Galactic Council next month. Jake grinned. Are we going to meet their admission requirements? Well, let's see. Stable government? Check. Non-aggressive intentions? Check. Ability to contribute to galactic civilization? Marcus's grin matched Jake's. Jake, buddy, we've been contributing to galactic civilization for 50 years. We've just been really modest about it. And the Council's response? Officially, they're reviewing humanity's application with careful consideration of all relevant factors. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. Unofficially? They're scared to death of what happens if they say no. Jake nodded thoughtfully. The past 6 months had been a fascinating exercise in interstellar diplomacy. It turned out that when a species everyone thought was extinct suddenly revealed they'd been successfully integrating into your society for decades. It raised some uncomfortable questions about your security, your intelligence services, and your fundamental understanding of what constituted a threat. Any word on the Darwin incident? Jake asked. Marcus's expression grew serious. Still classified. But let's just say that certain council members are being very careful about how they phrase their concerns regarding human adaptability. That ominous, huh? Let's just say that humans have a well-documented tendency to solve problems in ways that other species consider creative. Jake was still processing this when his communication device chimed with a message from Professor Zilthak. Student Webb, or should I say, Mr. Mitchell, your dissertation defense has been scheduled for next month. Topic: Practical Applications of Xenopsychological Theory, a case study in species reintegration. I expect it will be quite illuminating. Jake showed the message to Marcus, who nearly choked on his coffee. You're actually going to finish your degree? Hey, I've put too much work into this program to quit now. Besides, Jake grinned, I think I've got some unique insights into the subject matter. And after that? Jake looked out at the stars, thinking about the galaxy that had spent 50 years believing humans were extinct, only to discover they'd been neighbors all along. After that, I think I'll go into diplomacy. Turns out I have a talent for helping different species understand each other. Marcus raised his coffee cup in a toast. To Jake Mitchell, humanity's first official galactic diplomat, and the man who proved that the most dangerous thing about humans isn't our claws or our teeth. What is it then? Marcus's smile was absolutely predatory. Our sense of humor. As if to prove his point, Jake's communication device chimed again with a message from Director Kane. Phase 2 of Operation Neighborhood Watch is approved. Welcome to the galaxy, humanity. Try not to break anything important on your first day. Jake looked at the message, looked at Marcus, and started laughing. 50 years ago, the Galactic Council had declared humanity too dangerous to exist in civilized society. Now they were about to discover that they'd been living next door to humans all along, and that humans had spent those 50 years becoming very, very good neighbors. The kind of neighbors who helped with difficult problems, contributed to community projects, and only occasionally reminded you that they were capable of extremely creative solutions when peaceful cooperation wasn't working out. Jake had a feeling the galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear Professor Zilthak's voice. Class dismissed. Your homework is to remember that the most successful predators are the ones you never see coming. Humanity was back. They were here to help, and the galaxy would never be the same. End.